we're finishing off today. And I just want to say, not only on this topic, but on every topic of life that you can think of, following Jesus is about following Him in every area of life. It's not that we follow Jesus in the religious parts of life, and then the rest of it, we do whatever we want. Following Jesus is about submitting to His lordship and His leadership and His way of thinking in every area of life, starting in the home, starting with our family. Doesn't end there, but that's where it starts. And so this thing about marriage isn't something else in addition to Jesus or besides Jesus. It's trying to figure out in our day, in our time, in our culture, how do we follow Jesus in our marriages? And if you're not married, maybe someday you will be. If you're not married, maybe you have kids or friends that are or will be married, and you can share what you're learning in this series. If it doesn't apply to you today, it might apply to you tomorrow. And if it doesn't apply to you today or tomorrow, it might apply to somebody else you can help. So, you can sleep if you want, but no loud snoring. So, here's how we're going to start today. Turn to somebody next to you and tell them what you think are the top 3 most helpful things to remember when you're in a marital disagreement. Whether you're married or not, what do you think the top 3 things to remember might be when you get in an argument with your spouse? Ready? Go. Okay, thank you very much. What we want to do today is we want to look at 3 lines of approach toward marital conflict. 3 lines of approach toward marital conflict. Before the conflict happens, during the conflict, and after the conflict. And in this first part, before the conflict comes, before the argument comes, before the verbal warfare comes, what are you thinking about your spouse? What are you thinking about your spouse? We all have these imaginary conversations with our spouse, right? I mean, if you're not married, you probably have imaginary conversations with your roommate. And if you don't have a roommate, with your boss, or your colleagues, or those people at work you don't like, or your neighbors that you don't get along with, or your relatives that you like to really tell off. Right? Does anybody here never have those imaginary conversations? That's we all have them. But the question here, and the subject today is, what are you thinking about your spouse if you're married? If you're not married now and you will be someday, remember this when you get married. What kind of thoughts do you think? Where do you focus your thoughts? Do you see your spouse as an enemy? As a competitor? As somebody to straighten out? Somebody to change? How do you see somebody to control? I want us to read one of the longest passages about marriage in the Bible, certainly in the New Testament. And it's from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 23. Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus, and he says some radical things. For that day, these things were radical. Some of us still radical for today. And this is what he said. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. But I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Now, let's clarify what this doesn't mean, because I realize that some of us come from some backgrounds and some relationships that have been abusive and traumatizing. There is nothing in this passage that suggests that men should be the dictators of their family or their marriage, and the wife and everybody else should fall in line and do exactly what they want. Nothing. In fact, if you start with the first verse we looked at, verse 21, what does it say? This is the context. This verse is often not included when quoting this passage. This verse should always be included because it sets the context for the rest of it. What does verse 21 say? It says, submit to one another. It's a mutual submission. I submit my weaknesses to the strengths of my wife, and she submits her weaknesses to my strengths. That's called a team. That's called unity. That's called oneness. And that's what this passage is calling us to. Not blanket submission to control and abuse. Now that we've clarified that, let's talk about what it does mean. It means my spouse has strengths that bless me. Is that the way I think about my spouse? Do I think about my spouse as somebody who has strengths to bless me? Or do I think about my spouse as someone who has flaws that annoy me? Now, if we're honest, most of us are going to say, what? We're going to say a little of both. Right? At different times, we're going to recognize the strengths, and at other times, we're going to look too much at the flaws. And what I am suggesting is, today, that in this first line, or this first approach to marriage conflict, that we take a good look at how much we think, and what way do we think mostly about our spouse. Because this is the way of mutual submission, or the way of judgment and irritation. And if we're primarily focused on the way of judgment and being irritated by our spouse's flaws and weaknesses and differences from us, then we're not looking at it like God intended for us to. We're not looking at it like Christ looks at his bride, the church. Do we look at our spouse as our teammate or as our adversary? This is the way of thinking that is oneness or the opponent mentality. Oneness is what we're called to in marriage. Oneness does not mean I've lost myself in my spouse, and neither does it mean everything I do and everything I think and everything I say must be exactly the same as my spouse. No! Oneness and unity in the Bible is people with their differences coming together to pursue a common goal or purpose in love. That's biblical unity. That's biblical oneness. Do we think in the way of my spouse is there to help us demonstrate Christ's love for the church? Or do we think in the way of my spouse is there for me to change, or for me to correct, or for me to straighten out? This is the way of loving. It's His love versus our love. It's His way of love versus our way of love. What is the thinking that predominates the way that we look at our spouse? That will have a lot to determine what it looks like when we have a disagreement. That will play a huge part in what kind of interaction we have when we're seeing things differently and have different opinions about it. Paul said this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. For followers of Jesus, and I understand all of us here today may not be followers of Jesus, but for us, listen, this is really powerful. I got this from Gary Thomas, who wrote the book Sacred Marriage, and the subtitle of the book is this: what if God gave us marriage not to make us happy, but to make us holy? What if we understood that what Paul is saying here about Christian marriage is it's not about making yourself happy. It's not even about making your spouse happy. It's about providing together a picture of the gospel, an image of Christ's love for us. It's about showing people the reality of God and His power to change lives by living the kind of relationship that Christ lives with His church. Doing that in and through your marriage. How many of us, let's be honest, I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but I'm asking you to be honest with yourself. How many of us really have thought deeply about that being the primary purpose of Christian marriage? But if we did, what kind of a difference would it make? Not only in the longevity of marriages in our culture, but the quality of those longer-term marital relationships. So the first part is this idea of before the conflict happens, what are we thinking? How are we thinking? How do we see, primarily, how do we see our spouse? But there's a second approach, and that is during the conflict. Now, I thought about giving us a bunch of techniques to use when but I thought, you can Google that if you want to. There are lots of techniques out there. And techniques that are cut off from character really are useless, at least in the long term. So again, I want to continue in this way. It's more of a broader picture of how are you talking to your spouse. And what I mean by that is, there are just a few suggestions that I want to give us to think about here. And suggestion number one is that we all learn to listen well. James 1:19 says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. We were born with 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we would listen twice as much as we talk, but most of us have that backwards. And especially in marital relationships, that's going to be a killer. But learning to listen well. And there are different levels of listening. There's the pretend level. That's the stereotypical image of the guy reading his newspaper at the kitchen table, and his wife's going blah, 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 and the husband's going, yes, dear, yes, dear, yes, dear, and he's not listening at all, he's pretending, which isn't really listening. That's the lowest level, pretending. There's another kind of listening that most of us probably practice the most often, and that is listening in order to reply. While the other person's talking, you're thinking about, what am I going to say in response to what they're saying? And that's another level of listening. And in some cases, it's completely appropriate. But when emotions are high or strong, there's another kind of listening that is such a healing, unifying, powerful way of connecting people, whether you're married or not, but especially in marriage. And that's listening for the purpose of understanding. Period. Not fixing, not replying, not solving, not correcting, understanding. Period. Seek first to understand. Proverbs 13:15 says, Proverbs 13:15 says, good understanding produces favor. Good understanding produces favor. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I did read in a commentary that the Hebrew here gives the picture that when there's good understanding that's being communicated to somebody, it's like breaking down walls. Good understanding breaks down walls and brings people together. So sometimes what's necessary in a conflict is for you, which one, Scott? Are you talking about the husband or wife? You to be quiet and listen. For you to be quiet and listen. Whoever's going to be the most mature in the moment. That's going to be up to you. And then to take the time to just make sure you are listening so well that when the other person is done sharing, you can say back to them not only what they said, but how they feel about what they said, and then they will say, you got it. Then you'll know you listened well. We don't do that well in this culture. In fact, I've worked with cultures from all around the world, and I've yet to find a culture that naturally listens well. It takes an effort, and I would say almost a divine effort. We need God's help. We need God's empowerment to be able to do this well. And then secondly, once you listen, once you seek first to understand, then to be understood, then to have a turn. It's not all about my opinion doesn't count, what I say doesn't matter, I won't say anything, it's only and always the other person. No, that's not a team. That's not unity. That's not harmony. But to seek first to listen and then to be understood. In Ephesians 4:15, we should remember when we get to this point, speaking the truth in love. Not in anger, not in judgment, not in self-righteousness, but in love. And of course, everybody knows about I statements. Instead of saying, you're always late, or you made me mad, to be able to say, no, when you do this, or when you say this, I feel whatever it is. When you come home late, I feel disrespected. When you continue to watch the TV when I'm trying to tell you something, I feel unheard. I feel devalued. Everybody knows about I statements. Don't blame. Whose fault is it? It doesn't matter, and it's not a helpful question. It's never a helpful question. Whose fault is it? The helpful question is, who's going to take responsibility now? That's the helpful question. The helpful answer is, I'm going to take responsibility to do my part. Well, does the husband or the wife say that? Yes. If you want a growing, healthy relationship, you both say, I'm going to take my responsibility now. Focus on the issue. Don't focus on him. Don't focus on her. He or she is not the problem. The problem is the problem. So whatever problem has come between you, come together and force that problem to be in front of you and solve it together as the problem, not trying to solve or fix or change the other person. And when anger is strong or tension is high, hit the pause button and say, let's come back to this when we're both a little calmer. But don't make this mistake. This is what a lot of couples do if they get to this point. They say, let's take a break. And then they never get back together. Because then they calm down, they go, oh, I don't want to rock the boat and get upset again. No. Because it's there, even if you're not dealing with it. Make an appointment to come back and finish when you've calmed down. Vicki, would you come up here for a minute?
Yeah!
Oh, Vicki!
So Vicki and I, let's sit down. Vicki and I are going to give you a couple examples of the wrong way and the right way. A couple examples, the wrong way and the right way. So this first one will be around the issue of money. I'm seeing this charge here on our credit card, and I'm not sure what that is. Can you please help me understand what that charge is?
Are you my dad? I feel like I'm your employee and I have to account for something. But yes, I'll tell you what that is. Remember we talked about tools that we were going to need around the house, and this was on sale, and even though we don't need it right now, I thought let's spend
You're getting very defensive, and that's not necessary. All I can do is ask a question.
When I'm attacked, I get to kind of...
I believe I'm the one who we mutually decided would have the responsibility for the finances, and I'm just asking a question.
Okay, but
I don't feel like I should be attacked by you.
Fine. We'll wait till later, we'll pay more. Next time I'll check with you.
That's the problem. In case you were wondering. It might feel like familiar, right? That's the problem. All right. And actually, rather than calling it the right way and wrong way, let's call it the unhelpful way and the more helpful way. So that was the unhelpful way. And hopefully, this will look something like the more helpful way. Han, could you look at this for me? I'm doing the finances, and I'm seeing this charge here on our credit card that I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah. Well, remember we talked about that tool that we were going to look for? And it was on sale, so I thought, let's get it now and spend less. But I'm remembering that you said finances were tight, and I think I should have checked with you first. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to do next time.
Well, that's great. You came to that realization. Really quickly, much quicker than usual, and I appreciate that so much.
I can't say that I agree with the way that you decide to spend money sometimes, or the way I decide to spend money. But since we're a team, I should have talked to you about it first. I'm not going to talk to you about every little thing I get at the store, but this was kind of a big expense, and I probably should have checked.
Okay, thank you for that, and I don't want to be a drag, and I'm not trying to be controlling, I'm just trying to understand as I rectify these issues here. So, what I hear you saying is you actually wanted to save us money on this thing that we agreed we wanted, and I appreciate you wanting to save money, and I do appreciate the fact that next time we'll talk about it first. All right. It's not, everybody knows that when you're when you're playing and practicing, it's not real life, right? And truly, that went a little fast because we're just doing these in brief sound bites. But you see how the attitude is different, the approach is different, the mindset is different, and it will lead to a more healthy conclusion. All right, this next issue is going to be around sex. So I'm just coming home from work, and I'm plopping myself down on the couch next to my wife. Hey, babe. I couldn't wait to get home because I've been thinking about that little hint you dropped this morning about special dessert after supper tonight, after we get the kids in bed.
I had a horrific day. Thank you for asking.
Okay, let's hear about it.
Well, I'll tell you. The electricity was off for 4 hours because they were working down the street at something. The washing machine broke, the kids were brats, and you said you'd be home half an hour ago, and you never called, you never texted. Sorry, I'm just not really in the mood right now. I have a headache as well.
Another headache! What a surprise!
So you're telling me I have a headache, now you're calling me a liar.
Fine, you had a rough day. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I really feel you're sick. Okay, let's just get this over with, and then we can get on with the evening, and I can get back on.
Sorry, not even I'm in the mood now. Okay, hopefully you recognize that as the unhelpful way. Let's try it again. Hey, babe. Hey, I have just had a wonderful time today thinking about the little hint that you dropped at breakfast this morning about a potential dessert tonight after we get the kids in bed.
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, Penny. That completely went out of my head because I had a really horrible day.
Oh. Okay.
I'm not saying I'm opposed to it, I'm just saying at the moment I'm not in the mood because my emotions are all over the place after today.
Okay. Tell me about it.
Well, the electricity was off for 4 hours down the street. They're working on something and it messed up. I was in the middle of the laundry, I was in the middle of dinner. The kids were not cooperative today. And you're late. I asked you to be home by 5:30 or so, and
I know.
it's frustrating.
I'm truly sorry. It wasn't intentional. I probably should have called, and I'm truly sorry. And honestly, I'm sorry to hear that you had such a difficult day. I try to imagine myself in the same situation, and I would probably be very frustrated.
But we can't get to dessert, but I want to start with the
Can we have dessert before supper tonight? And then finally, after the conflict happens, how are you treating your spouse? Now, how you treat your spouse is important all the time. How you think about your spouse is important all the time. How you talk to your spouse is important all the time. But we're talking specifically today about how to fight fair, how to have arguments and conflict, because conflict is inevitable, and conflict is not a bad thing. It's just inevitable when you have different people with different perspectives and different ideas and different feelings, and they come together. There's going to be conflict. The question is, how do you handle it? So in the context of conflict, what about how you treat your spouse right after the conflict? First of all, apologize. One of the best things one of the most important things that Vicki ever taught me about this, because I've always been the kind of person, I'm not going to apologize if I don't think I was really wrong. And what she taught me was, can you apologize for something? Can you apologize for the way you said it? Can you apologize for the timing? Can you apologize for... And when I say apologize, it doesn't mean, oh, I'm so sorry, you're so sensitive. That's not an apology. But to be able to say that you're sorry for something is an important step in apologizing. And for us, there has been usually a 3-step apology. To say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, will you forgive me? I'm sorry, I was wrong, will you forgive me? And because we're committed to each other in the way of Jesus, we already know the answers to these questions. We always know the other is going to forgive. The other is going to choose to forgive because we want to live. We want to be married. We want to relate in the way of Jesus. But it's important to have them say it, and it's important to hear it. So that's the first. The second is, if there's any follow-up or follow-through that needs to happen as a result of the discussion, any action points. Maybe one spouse is saying to the other, I feel like I'm the only one who does all the work around the house, and I need some help. Then following through with helping as soon as possible is an important way to treat your spouse. Now, makeup sex can be good, or it can be really bad. So what I want to say about that is this. Sometimes for one of the people in the marriage, and maybe it's the wife one time, and maybe it's the husband another time, but there needs to be a little time, and there needs to be a little demonstration before sex about the sincerity of the apology or the sincerity of the commitment to follow through. It can actually be traumatizing to come together too quickly if it's a very serious conflict. So I'm just saying it's not the same in every situation, so be careful and be sensitive about that. And then finally, I would say, pay attention to your spouse's love language. When I say the phrase love language, how many of you don't know what I'm talking about? Okay, there's a few of us. So, I'm going to close with this. An anthropologist, whose name I'm blanking out on, who wrote Gary Chapman. Gary Chapman did a study, it was actually around the world, that everybody has basically 5 love languages. That is, ways they communicate with people who are important to them that make them feel loved and then express their love to others. And they are acts of service, physical affection, gift giving, quality time, and words of affirmation. And all of us appreciate all of those, but there are 1 or 2 that are usually the big ways that we really feel it when our spouse expresses love to us, or we tend to give it and express that way to our spouse and others. If you don't know your spouse's primary love language, you find out as quickly as possible. And make sure that after an argument or conflict, you are communicating in that way. You don't always have to be fluent in that way. Your love language might be different than theirs. But find out what theirs is, and at least become somewhat conversant in that language, especially after a conflict. Okay? There, you can, if you don't know or they don't know, there are assessments, just Google it online, the 5 love language test, or the 5 love language assessment, and you can find out what yours is or theirs is. But that's just wrapping up. The way you think about your spouse beforehand, the way you talk to your spouse during the conflict, and the way you treat your spouse afterwards. Before, during, after. These are the ways that I want to encourage us to think about how we're interacting with our spouse. Our spouse today or our spouse in the future, if we're not married now. Lord, I want to thank you for this. It is truly an amazing gift called marriage. It's also an amazing challenge and an amazing laboratory for learning self-denial and an amazing opportunity with the potential to show the gospel to the people around us who can see you and your love for the church by looking at some of our marriages. Some of us aren't there yet. Some of us are there sometimes and then other times. One thing is sure, God, we need the Holy Spirit. We need your help in developing marriages that reflect Christ's love for the church. So let your kingdom come and let your will be done in and through our relationships, for our good, for the blessing of others, and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.